What can the Shroud of Turin tell us about how much God thinks each one of us is worth? I'll be right back. Gracious gang, welcome back to the Gracious Guest Show. I'm your host, your humble host, Mike Creevy, in the office here again with you, my theologically and Star Wars oriented and themed office space here, which I love so much. Little home studio. I always feel really cozy in here, and we're getting ready for the new school year, so it's been a pretty crazy week as we're getting ready to launch into another year of for our high school students coming up this next week. But I really was blessed amidst all this craziness to be able to set up this interview with Mr. Russ Breault to come on and talk about the Shroud of Turin, and especially some particularly intriguing aspects of the Shroud that we haven't really looked at here on the channel before. So before we do anything, though, please make sure, as always, you subscribe to this channel, like this video, share this video far and wide. If you're listening on the podcast version, hey there, everybody. You can't see it, but you can still hear it, which is awesome. So thank you. Please spread the word. Like this content on there as well. If you could do me a favor and give me good reviews. Get some thumbs up out there, some good reviews, 5-star reviews, and ratings and reviews, that sort of thing. Anywhere you can do that. So on the Apple Podcasts sort of aggregator there, you could use Google Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher. My gosh, there's so many. There's a bunch I'm forgetting right now. But anyway, thank you for joining me here today. And as I mentioned, my guest today is Mr. Russ Breault. And let me just share with you his biography here that Russ sent to me. It's just really impressive sort of CV here when it comes to the Shroud of Turin. So, Russ Breault has been researching and lecturing on the Shroud of Turin for over 30 years. His highly acclaimed presentation, known as Shroud Encounter, makes use of over 200 superb images and unfolds like a CSI investigation. Russ Breault has presented to hundreds of audiences from New York to Hawaii. College and university presentations include Duke, Johns Hopkins, Penn State, Cal State, West Point, and many others. He has appeared in several nationally televised documentaries, including Mysteries of the Ancient World on CBS. Most recently, he appeared in the highly acclaimed Uncovering the Face of Jesus, a 2-hour documentary on the History Channel. Mr. Breault was both advisor and a primary expert for the groundbreaking program. He was a primary expert also for EWTN's documentary, The Holy Winding Sheet. Russ has been interviewed for Good Morning America, World News Tonight, and was a consultant for CNN's Finding Jesus episode on the Shroud. He was a key consultant, more recently, to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. for the development of a high-tech interactive exhibit on the Shroud, viewed by over 80,000 people from February to July of 2022. He hosted and produced 12 episodes of the Shroud Report, half-hour interview shows with the world's leading experts, all seen on YouTube today. He has participated in over a dozen international research symposia since 1981 and was the keynote speaker for the last 3 conferences in 2014, 2017, and 2019. Russ has personally viewed the Shroud in Turin, Italy, 3 times in 1998, 2000, and 2010. He's a longtime member of the Shroud Science Group, an international consortium of scientists and scholars dedicated to further research. Mr. Breault is the president and founder of the Shroud of Turin Education Project, Incorporated, the mission of which is to, quote, advance the knowledge of the Shroud to a new generation, end quote. And his website, I have all the information in the show notes if you want to check that out, which I'll mention again at the end, is www.shroudencounter.com. But enough of all that. Let's just dive headlong into this really just thrilling conversation I got to have the other day with Mr. Russ Breault. Let's check it out. All right, Russ Breault, thank you for being my gracious guest today.
Well, my pleasure to be with you.
Well, and it's like I was telling you before we started recording here, this topic, I don't even know if topic is a word that does the Shroud justice, but all things Shroud, for whatever reason, and I think I know some of them at least from my experience over the last couple of years with this. Anytime you post anything about the shroud, or especially the shroud and the Sudarium of Oviedo. This seems to generate a tremendous amount of interest, and people seem very hungry for all sorts of insights into the shroud. So I just wanted to start by asking you really about your own experience, just some of your own background, whatever you want to share about how the shroud first kind of got on your radar, and your involvement with the shroud, how that really began.
Well, I've been involved for a very long time, and I was a I was a writer for the college newspaper all the way back in 1980. And is that this life or another life?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. The and and news of the Shroud was really huge because in 1978 you had a whole team of 33 American scientists go to Turin to study this artifact, this religious relic, if you will, that purported to be the burial shroud of Jesus. And they have access to this cloth for 5 days and nights, round the clock, 120 hours. Well, this is enormous news. This is unprecedented. I mean, half the scientists were involved with NASA and space and space age stuff, which was really hot back then in the 70s.
Sure.
And it's and so so in 1980, in June of 80, National Geographic wrote a big piece about it. And so I asked if I could write some articles about it for the college newspaper because I thought it was really intriguing. And so after I did all my research, I was hooked. And I said, man, this is one seriously cool mystery, and nobody knows anything about it. And this kind of became a life's passion, kind of organically on its own. And now it's interesting from a Christian perspective is that I was a fairly new believer at the time. I was very excited about my faith, and so a lot of people ask me, was the shroud instrumental in you coming to faith? And I'd say no, it wasn't.
Mhm.
But what captured my interest was just thinking of all the proverbial doubting Thomases in the world who are
Sure.
holding on and looking for some kind of evidence to justify their any kind of move towards faith. And I saw the shroud from that standpoint, and that's what was very exciting to me about it, and that's why that's what keeps me involved
Hmm.
even today is the potential of the shroud. I mean, and the significance of it. If we were to be able to prove it absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to be in fact the burial shroud of Jesus, it would be pretty earth shaking.
Right.
And so all of us who are involved in shroud research, hang on for that very reason. And the reason, and the fact is that it's kind of ludicrous, if you will, that after all the science that's been applied to the cloth, that somehow it remains an unsolved mystery. That's kind
Right.
of ridiculous on its face. I mean,
Sure.
really? Because the alternative is it's some alleged work of a 14th century artist or a forger of some kind.
Hmm.
And I'm saying we can't figure out some effort by some 14th century artist to craft something that was used to mimic the burial shroud of Jesus to be passed off as some bona fide relic. I find that rather preposterous also. So, anyways,
Right.
it's a long answer to a
Oh yeah.
short
No.
question.
Well, no. Well, and something I wanted to ask you about when you mentioned about writing for the university paper. One thing that sort of jumped in my mind was I'm just curious what your experience was at the time with you know sort of the student reader who read some of those articles at that time specifically, and before the internet, before really, like you said, public knowledge about what was going on with the shroud was really well known. What kind of reception did that get at the time?
There was actually surprisingly positive reception because there wasn't the apartheid that we see today, there wasn't the chasm
Hmm.
that exists, now between those that are truly hostile towards the faith. I think
Sure.
there was a genuine. I mean, people were maybe ambivalent towards the faith, but they weren't hostile towards it. So I think for the most part there was a good deal of openness towards this, and it kind of exciting to see what science may ultimately reveal.
Sure. Yeah, and it was curious, and part of the reason I ask is because one of the reasons that uh, this sort of shroud focus became a recurring theme on my own channel here, which I use to do a lot of different stuff for sort of teaching and evangelization and that sort of thing, was just because I was sharing some very basic bullet points, some of the real sort of surface level discoveries about the shroud that are themselves just astonishing with my ninth graders. And
Hmm.
it was, I mean, I've been doing it for a few years now, and every single time I do it, it's one of, if not the number one thing that they say in surveys afterward was like, oh, that was the coolest thing we did all year, you know. So so that's been my experience too, with just even in this kind of cultural milieu, there does seem to be, I don't know, there's something arresting about. Do you think it's possibly too, because we're not just talking about something that is a just an article of cloth or some sort of personal effect or something we're studying. It's this face, right? This there's something so personal about this particular relic, if you want to call it that, of course. So what do you have to think about that as far as the
Well,
personal dimension of this with that face?
first of all, I can guarantee you that those ninth graders that you present to will remember it long after they're graduated from high school and college.
Hmm.
It is a lasting impact. They won't forget it,
Hmm.
and it's and so I think it's very it's uncanny how people remember it and respond to it. Um, the message of the shroud is an astonishing message. You can leave church, and you can by the time you're done with lunch, you have forgotten what the pastor preached about, but you will not forget the shroud when you're exposed to it, and when you see the images and understand its meaning and its message.
Yeah, because I
Um,
find I have right up here above my desk um, the high quality negative, or well, like, how it is, it's the positive of the, that whole reality, but the sort of black and white
right.
face, it really pops. The 3D really comes out, and I got it from the shroud.org, and it's every time I am just sitting here writing or working or in prayer, it's amazing to me how there's just something that wells up inside me, like this desire, this fundamental desire to be better, or to be more humble, or to back off some unforgiveness, or maybe an uncharitable attitude I have towards somebody. It really, to me, it seems to have the effect that I imagine if Jesus were physically standing right in my office and I'm looking him in the face, how would I feel? How would I feel towards others? So I think that's important. Maybe it's not proof, but I think that's important evidence of some kind.
No, I think it's a very valid point in the fact that I like to say that that the scripture gives us his name, Jesus, and the shroud gives us his face.
Mm,
Everyone wants to put a name with a face, and that's exactly what the shroud does.
mm,
Now, but I think it's much deeper than that. When you look in the Old Testament, um, no one ever saw the face of God, not even Moses. Moses is
hmm
up on the mountain getting the tablets, and he says to God, "Now show me your glory." And God responds and says, "Moses, no one can see my face and live."
mm,
And so it's interesting. So Moses says, "Show me your glory," and God responds by saying, "No one can see my face and live." And so you can see my backside.
hmm
And then but now fast forward to the New Testament, everybody sees the face of God in the person of Jesus Christ, and Jesus is called the Word of God made flesh, and we beheld His glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father.
Oh, yes.
And it's and then in Second Corinthians it says that the that the glory of God is revealed in the face of Jesus. And Paul writes and says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the express manifestation of His being. And so something dramatically happened between Old Testament and New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And that something that happened is that the Son of God became one of us, became
Right.
a human being, and participated in our humanity from birth to death.
Mm.
And we beheld, and they beheld at the first century His glory. And now we have to ask the question: was that only for those living in first century, or did God, through His grace and His mercy, allow that for to be seen through all generations by way of the shroud? And now, as for anyone who are familiar with the history of the shroud, certainly the early Byzantine icons of Jesus called the true likeness, where we
Mm-hmm.
see that beginning in the 6th century, we have the motif of the long hair, full beard, large hollow eyes, long flattened nose, sprots of hair, stylistically looking very similar to what we see on the shroud. That
Right.
becomes dominant within Byzantine iconography in the early 6th century. And we think that that's based directly on the shroud itself. And now
Mm.
you fast forward into the modern era, and photography circulates the world. As you mentioned, when Secondo Pia, the amateur photographer, took his first photograph in 1898 and saw that photo negative image, the image that appears on the negative plate.
Right.
He says, the story goes, he almost fell out of the window of his Turin apartment. He was so stunned by what he saw, and
Yeah.
his own feeling was that he saw the face of God, because no one had ever seen that image prior to 1898.
Right.
And so why is the face so compelling on the shroud? And I think it's this. It's because if you do a word study on the face, God throughout the um, God says that He hides His face.
Hmm.
He turns His face from us. I mean, that's not good.
Hmm.
But blessing is when God turns His face towards you. That's a sign of blessing and favor. And so
Right.
I think the significance of the face image on the shroud is that because of the cross, He is not turning or hiding His face from us.
Hmm.
We see Him straight on, and I think that's a sign that we are fully accepted in Christ.
I was just doing a little quick on the spot etymology review because I haven't thought of this in a while. But the Greek term prosopon, which then we get, we talk about personhood through that, right? This
Mm-hmm.
etymological connection between your person and this Greek term for your face, right? Or the mask that someone's wearing in Greek theater, and it has
Mm-hmm.
this dual or this multiple usage. And I find that very interesting, where we wouldn't say that it's not a mask in the sense that it's somehow portraying something false, right, or misleading, but just this beautiful reality that the that this, like you said, this God Himself, who is so perfect and so transcendent, so utterly ineffable, unreachable, like C.S. Lewis likes to talk about in his novel Till We Have Faces, right? This idea that we can't look on the face of God before we ourselves have faces. How do you relate like that? So He comes down to us in this very simple way that those of us who are seeking power and grandeur and all that are gonna miss it potentially. And so I think with that kind of segues into my question for you here, kind of the meat of some of what I wanted to get into with you when it comes to some of those details, those incredibly
Mm.
concrete, fascinating uh, things that the data, the evidence, right in the cloth itself, or in the blood or the image, all these different elements that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. What are
Sure.
just maybe some of we can go anywhere you want with this, as far as some of the pieces of evidence that you find most compelling, as far as reasons to believe this shroud is authentic.
Well, I think that you have to start with the work of the Shroud of Turin Research Project, with that huge scientific project that occurred in '78,
Hmm.
and look at their basic findings. And they went over there to answer two questions: what is the cause of the image, and what is the nature of the blood stains?
Mm.
And they came away mystified, is that they still had no plausible cause for the image. Now, why is that? Because one of the most important results of the Shroud Project is that there's no visible trace of any kind of paint, ink,
Mm.
dye, pigmentation, or stain. There are no artistic substances on the cloth to account for the image. There are random particles, sure, because it's been around for a long time. A lot of things have been touched to the surface of the cloth and all that stuff, but there's nothing in the image areas in any concentration that would
Mm.
account for the image. And then you have the pattern of blood stains, and the blood, is it just paint? Is it animal blood? Is it human blood? Well, in fact, it is certainly primate blood for sure. Looking at serological tests, and
Hmm.
I don't think anyone went to the effort of trying to kill a monkey to perpetrate a fraud. I think a dog blood would have been fine if this is just nothing more than a fraud.
Mm.
So it is human blood, and it's AB blood type with human male DNA. We determined that in 1995. Um, so so now then you have the testimony of the blood chemists that would say that this appears to be the exudate of wounds.
Mm.
Now, why the exudate? Because we don't see whole blood; we see blood components.
Okay.
So it's not like blood was just painted on the cloth. No, this is blood that oozed onto the cloth while it was clotting on the body. That's what we see on the shroud,
Mm.
chemistry wise. It's a very high content of bilirubin. Bilirubin
Right.
is an enzyme that is released into the bloodstream during conditions of severe stress. I think crucifixion might qualify.
Yeah.
And so now, when you compare the image versus the bloodstains, we realize that there's no image under the blood. That's important, because that tells you something. That tells you the order of events. Is
Mm.
that if there's no image under the blood, then that means the blood was on the cloth first,
Right.
followed by the image. So the question is, when did the image get there? Well, we don't know, but maybe 3 days later. I don't know, but but it makes sense if it's authentic, right?
Sure.
Good Friday followed by Easter Sunday, but it makes no sense if it's the work of an artist. And that
Right.
every single known attempt by someone to replicate the shroud image, to show how some alleged medieval artist crafted this, they create their image, everyone using a different technique, because no one knows, because there is no discernible process on the shroud.
Sure.
So everyone comes up with a whole new theory as to how the shroud could have been created. They craft their image, and then they paint the blood where it's supposed to go. No,
Mm.
no, no. Blood first, then image. You do that,
Right.
and for a 5 foot or 6 foot crucified man, front and back, blood stains all over the front of the body, all over the back of the body.
Hmm.
You think? I mean, it would literally be impossible. And
Right.
um,
And just again,
so
because you're not just talking about, like, okay, well, what, someone's trying to hoax this, like you were saying earlier, like, what is the likelihood of being able to do that? And you go, it's not just, okay, what do I need? I need palm wounds or wrist wounds. I need foot wounds. I need a side wound. I need some wounds on the head. You need a lot more than that, and you have on the shroud, you have, I forget the exact number off the top of my head. I had it last time, but hundreds of distinct wounds
Yeah.
all over the body, front and back, from a lot of different kinds of trauma through the crucifixion. Of course, if it's authentic, and that's something that would be an amount of detail that would be, if not impossible, absolutely unlikely, as best I can tell, that anybody could be able to pull that off.
Well, yeah, and the forensic pathologists who have looked at it say that the blood stains have a natural flow, that they don't look painted. There's nothing on the shroud that would indicate artistic style.
Mm,
And this is really important because another way to argue the shroud, if it becomes, and I do a lecture called Art, Icon, or Relic,
mm,
exploring the shroud from a standpoint of art, which is this. Okay, it either is or it isn't, right? If it, either there
right,
is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus or it's not. And if it's not, well, then what is it? Well, then it must be the work of an artist. It must be the
right.
work of human effort, some way, somehow. And from that standpoint, then, your couple of your leading skeptics have proposed a couple 14th century artists
Mhm.
who could be likely candidates to have mastermind this greatest fraud of all history and in all history. And one of them is Simone Martini,
Mhm.
and the other one is a student of Simone Martini named Nato Ceccarelli. They were
Okay.
both painting in the early and mid 1300s. Um, and yet, if you look at their crucifixion scenes that they've painted, they are nothing like what we see on the shroud.
Right.
Nothing. And I'm saying,
Far more
how
conventional, correct, to the notions of where certain wounds would have been based on more
exactly,
Renaissance or well pre-Renaissance era or medieval notions.
exactly,
Because correct me if I'm wrong, but we had base. I mean, crucifixion hadn't been legally. It was this Roman execution method that died out. People hadn't used it in a long time, and the only real record I think your average person tended to have at that time of it was what you'd hear in the Gospels, which is not forensically accurate. I mean, it's not super detailed in the forensic sort of way of a description of it.
yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. Crucifixion was basically ended in the 4th century, and so we're talking about someone reviving it 1,000 years later. And with all this alleged knowledge of crucifixions, for instance, I mean, because I think that this contrary of view is important,
Hmm.
because if it's not authentic, then someone must have created it. And the two best skeptics that have come up with these two names. And on the shroud you have crown of thorns all around the head, scrapes and blood flows. Yet both of these artists will show just a decorative crown of thorns with barely any blood at all.
Right.
Okay. On the shroud you have scourge marks on the front chest and thighs as well as the back. These two artists never show any scourge marks on the front at all. Um, on the shroud, we see a side wound with blood kind of oozing out of it because it's post-mortem blood that flowed after death when the heart was no longer pumping, therefore the
Mm,
blood was no longer circulating. Where both of these artists show the blood spurting out like it was some kind of a faucet or something.
right.
And both on the shroud we see the nail wound in the wrist with blood flowing down the arm, pooling at the elbow and dropping
Mm,
down. Both of these artists show the nail wound in the palm of the hand. Oh, it's decorative, it's nice, it's pretty, but it's
right.
not going to hold the weight of a crucified man. And nail
Right.
had to be in the wrist. Okay, so artistically they show the nail here, and they
Mm,
show the blood falling straight down, not down the arm and
not
pooling
down
at
the
the
arm.
elbow, falling straight down. And so and
Hmm.
and every and even when you go into the lower extremities, they both show Jesus wrapped with some kind of a modesty cloth. On the
Hmm.
shroud he's naked.
Right.
So there is nothing that is similar artistically between these two alleged artists that in
Mm,
any way compares with the shroud. Now we're supposed to believe that these artists suspended and abandoned all of their known artistic methodology, all of their everything that they've come to know and how to represent Jesus through art. They've just abandoned it all and somehow crafted an image without the use of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, or stain. And the whole notion is ludicrous on its face. And
Sure.
yet this is the best thing that skeptics have to offer.
Hmm.
I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, and I know because, Dr. John Jackson, I know I've heard him point this out a few times that, that it's, if somebody next week comes up with some methodology, some method that they can demonstrate that seems at least to reproduce one aspect of the mystery of the shroud, that's still not sufficient because you have to do them all. You have to
Sure.
you have to have all of the blood and the wounds and everything match up like we're just talking about. You also have to have the bizarre characteristics of the image itself match up, which they can't do. So it's I think that's a really compelling point as well, is that this isn't theory. That's what's so fascinating to me about it is it's right there. I mean, it's the most studied thing in the world, and we still keep coming up with what is
Well,
there? How do you do? It's just amazing.
well, to your question, no, what I don't think I've fully answered
Mhm.
is it is this extreme superficiality of the image.
Mm.
The fact that not only does it not have any trace of any of these substances on the cloth, but it's exceedingly superficial, the image itself. So, in other words, it only affects the top 1 to 2 microfibers of the cloth,
Mm.
not threads, fibers. So, in
Right.
other words, each individual thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So that means that this image, where on the threads that are affected by the image, it only penetrates about 1% of the thread. It does not
Mm.
penetrate through to the other side. Whereas the bloodstains go all the way through. It was in a
Right.
fire in 1532. You have these 8 burns which were patched up and scorch marks, and all that goes through, all the way through.
Mm.
It was doused with water. It's a whole pattern of water stains. Water stains soak all the way through. So in other words, if you took the cloth and flipped it over, you would see the blood stains, the water stains, the burns, but you would not see the image of the man. And so it is this extremely superficiality of the image, which I find is
Right.
just astonishing. And then
Wow.
and
Hmm.
so and then of course we've already touched on the photo negative aspect of it. It's there's a prominent art historian name is Thomas de Wesselo. He wrote a book in 2012 called The Sign. It's a good book. I don't like his premise at the end, but it's overall I think it's a good book. And it's
What's the name of the
uh,
book again? I'm sorry. It's
The Sign.
this. Okay, this one.
And it's but from the standpoint of a very knowledgeable art historian, knowledgeable of all things medieval,
Mhm.
he'd tell you plainly that there's no possible way that the shroud is the result of the work of a medieval artist. Number one, for the things I've already mentioned, because it violates all artistic convention of the time from the
Mhm.
14th century, and then secondly is because of the photo negative image, is because there's no way that they could have ever conceived it, and it's because again, photography itself wasn't invented until 1830, and yet the shroud has a known history in Western Europe, beginning in the 1350 or so range, and then there's a history prior to that in Constantinople and Edessa,
Mm.
going at least as far back to the 6th century. So the so I think that's important too. Is that this photo negative quality of it, where it just comes alive in a photo
Right.
negative, is really interesting. And for your listeners, let me just make this clearer.
Hmm.
Because we don't deal a lot with photo negatives anymore. But for anyone who maybe remember taking pictures with film, you might take that 35 millimeter canister
Hmm.
down the down to Walmart and get your pictures back, and in
I'm
back of
old
the
enough to
picture,
remember that.
in back of the pictures is a little sleeve of
Hmm.
negatives, right? You hold the negatives up to the light and you say, who is that? You
Right.
have to develop it to see what's on the negative. So it begs the question, why then does the image look so much clearer, so much more lifelike in the photo negative? And the only explanation is that the image that is on the cloth itself must be a negative image to start with.
Mm.
Therefore, what shows up in a photo negative is actually a positive image.
Right.
And that's what makes the whole thing so preposterous.
Yeah.
And it's, and then,
And just to clarify, so in other words, to create that image as it is, like, again, this isn't theory. You go to Turin when they're doing a display and you can see it right there. And what you're seeing with your naked eye is a photo negative. Meaning,
yes,
if somebody did hoax it, they would have to create that image of a human being completely the reverse in every single detail of how we normally see each other.
yeah.
Right?
I mean,
Like,
that's
what we
the
normally
thing
see
that
as
makes
shadow
it.
needs to be flipped. I mean, how could anyone realistically do that?
I mean, it's so pronounced
Yeah.
that when you Google the shroud, what you'll almost always see is the photo negative image, the
Right.
image that appears in a photo negative. You almost never see the actual natural image itself because it's
Right.
so faint you can
Yeah.
hardly see it.
Yeah.
And so they always publish the photo negative image because it's so much clearer and so much more and so much more visible.
Right.
And it's one of the intriguing aspects of the shroud is that when you contrast it with art, is that the closer you get to the shroud, the less detail you see, to the point where you get
Oh.
closer than 6 feet, you can't see it. You have to
Hmm.
stand back from it to see what's on it. It's so superficial.
Wow.
Yet the closer you get to a painting, the more detail you see. You can get into the brush strokes and see the actual various densities of the art and the different colors used. I mean, you get closer and closer and closer with the magnifying glass. You see more and more and more detail. Don't see it with
Right.
the shroud. I mean, it's so because
Hmm.
you get to that point where you say, "Where'd it go? I don't see it. You'd have to stand back from it in order to get your orientation again."
Hmm.
It's and so it begs the question, how did someone craft this image? And then
Well, and
so
that's so stunning to me. Just, never gets old for me because, again, like, occasionally when you Google it, occasionally you'll find a version of it that somebody has touched up, or they've tried to do something artistic with the image or with the photo negative, for some artistic purpose. But most of the time, it's basically an unaltered, unfiltered, unaffected photographic negative of just the photo of the shroud itself as is, meaning that, that detail we see in that more black and white one, or sometimes it's like a darker brown, but that photo negative is so pronounced, so three-dimensionally crisp and high resolution. And what you're seeing in that is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, that is photographic data that is in that shroud.
yeah,
Like, it's
yeah,
it hasn't been
it's
altered.
it's
That's what's
it's
the information in the cloth or in the image itself.
it's information that was kind of hidden away within the natural image and then gets revealed in the photo negative.
Hmm.
It's um,
Wow.
I so and all this comes down to the meaning and the message, right? I
Hmm.
mean, because you can do the science until the cows come home, and you're never gonna. And there's a lot of people you just never satisfy.
Sure.
It's but you know, the most obnoxious question I ever get is someone this is usually a believer and usually an evangelical or Protestant who says, and who says this, well, I don't need the shroud for my faith. And I'm saying, that's great. That doesn't mean it wasn't meant for somebody else.
Hmm.
I mean, God, how short-sighted can you be?
Right.
I mean, well, it's true. I mean, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who believe and have not seen." Yes, that's
Sure.
exactly right. But he did not condemn people he did not condemn Thomas, who classically
Right.
said that, right?
Yeah.
Unless in the upper room, unless I crosses his arms and says, no, I can't believe. I won't. Not until I thrust my hand into his side and place
Yeah.
my fingers into his nail wounds, right?
Yeah.
And so then the second time in the upper room, Jesus is there. And Thomas is there too. Thomas wasn't there the first time. And that's when Jesus says, blessed are those who believe and have not seen. But he didn't condemn Thomas for his unbelief. And
Sure.
but what Thomas did, which relates to the shroud, in my opinion, is that once doubting Thomas, as he's always known as, once he sees the resurrected Christ for himself, then he goes on to make the strongest profession of faith in the entire New Testament.
Sure.
He says, "My Lord and my God." But for some reason, in spite of the testimony of all of his best friends, during the whole week, they were saying it's true. He's alive. He was here. We touched him. We broke bread. It was amazing. Where were you? In spite of all that, he holds on to his unbelief until he sees Christ resurrected for himself. And I think that's the message of the shroud. I think that's why it exists. I think that's why God, in His mercy, allowed it to be transferred from one generation to the next, and let me just explain why I believe this so strongly. Is because in the gospel of John, the story there is I think it's John 20 verses 1 through 9. Mary Magdalene and the other woman are going to the tomb on Sunday morning, and they're going to go and finish preparing the body for burial. They have all this anointing stuff with them, and when they get there, they see that the stone has already been rolled aside from the entrance, and Mary looks in, sees that the body's gone, and then runs to find Peter and John, and says to them, quote, "Someone has taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they've put him." So her first reaction is that someone has taken or stolen the body. Peter and John run back down. John gets there first.
That's my painting right here. Was it the Bernard
That's right.
painting?
That's right. I see it. Yeah.
They're on their way to see.
They're on their way. Mm-hmm. John gets there first, makes a point of letting everyone know that he got there first, and then Peter, he hobbles along. He goes straight into the tomb. He doesn't hesitate. He goes right in, sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John, he goes in. He also notices the cloth lying there and believes.
Right.
Now, we find in the Gospel of Luke, I believe, it doesn't say this in John, but it says Peter walked away wondering. He wasn't quite sure what he saw. John knew exactly what he saw. He saw this linen cloth lying there and believed. So it begs the question then, what was it that John saw that Mary didn't see? Mary thinks the body's stolen. John goes in, sees the linen cloth lying there, and believes that he had risen, or at least believed that something extraordinary had occurred.
Right.
And it's so the question is, what did they see? Now, I don't know if they saw images or not, because one of the things about Scripture is that it tells us a lot, but it doesn't tell us everything.
Right.
And then, but here's my point here, is that here John becomes the first believer in the resurrection based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there. Now, was the linen cloth lying there only meant for the benefit of Peter and John, or was it meant for the benefit of the all generations and for the entire and for the whole world? That's the question. Because that's the only choice we have. It was either only meant for the benefit of Peter and John, or it was meant for the whole world through all generations. And I can't imagine that it was left there only for the benefit of Peter and John. That doesn't sound like God's style. It's
Right.
the so now with regard to images, I think there's a very valid reason why we have to remember that these gospel stories were not written down until about 30 years after the events in question, at a time when persecution was pretty hot. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they had already murdered James in 42. There was a lot of persecution going on, so they weren't probably ready to disclose in any of these gospels anything that would suggest the whereabouts of this cloth.
Right.
The However, in the 6th century, it's called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. It is liturgy that is brought to Spain by a group of Arab Catholics in the
Mm-hmm.
sixth, and they translate that same chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. It says, Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. And I'm saying,
Hmm.
wow.
I
Now
haven't heard that.
that's not in scripture,
Wow.
but it's 1,500 years old. It's
Yeah.
how they chose to translate John chapter 20, verses 5 and 6, based on what? Based on knowledge of that cloth was in existence in the 6th century, for them to have represented it in that fashion. And it's you have the what is it? The name escapes me. The Pope Sylvester in
Mm-hmm.
325 establishes by papal decree that the altar on which the communion elements are served must be covered with a long linen cloth representing the clean shroud of Christ.
Mm.
So in the early 4th century, you have this knowledge of this long linen cloth covering the altar, representing the clean shroud of Christ. This is important because you have a lot of people running around that will look at various translations and say, aha, see, Jesus was wound in strips. No,
Mm.
he wasn't. In fact, even the Egyptians weren't even doing that by the time the 1st century rolled
Is that
around.
Russ? Is
And
that because of the translation with cloths plural
yeah,
that John Jackson I've seen get at with the basically the shroud, but then like a strip
yeah,
to
and John
wrap
mentioned
it,
various
which is
translations of John
yeah,
say, strips of linen,
yeah,
in addition to the napkin that was about his
right,
face, which we presume at this point is in fact the Sudarium of Oviedo,
sure,
which is in Oviedo, Spain, and that's a whole other talk.
right,
And
yeah,
it's and then you have Theodore of Mapuestia. He was
hmm,
the bishop of Antioch,
sure,
and this is in the 5th century. He in his catechism for the mass said that the two deacons who walked down the aisle holding the linen cloth, who then cover the altar with that cloth, those deacons represent the image that is on the shroud. And
wow,
so now there are not now so there's clear knowledge of a long linen cloth. And then you have the 6th century mention of the Mozarabic rite, which I've already mentioned. There was obviously knowledge of the shroud in existence in the early church, and was instrumental in the development of the mass itself. And
hmm.
it's so
Well, and again, that's just fascinating. Again, just to reiterate this, because once more, there's no explicit mention of any image whatsoever on the cloths in Scripture. It just says the
right.
cloths are there, and so this is interesting that you have not just one random, well, maybe that could be. It's you have these liturgical details popping up all over the place with this explicit mention of this, this understanding, and again, like the art, we talked about that a little bit earlier, but that's a theme that I keep going back to, and I'm seeing some new research on that. I'm going to hopefully get some guests on to talk about that a little more,
Hmm.
because that struck me when I didn't know much about the shroud, and I was in the Holy Land. This was like 10, well, 12 or 13 years ago. And, you see a couple of original and then some reproductions of depictions of Christ in those early decades and early centuries. And he's always, without exception, and in terms of all the stuff that I saw at least, he's always depicted in a very Roman style. He's got short hair, he's clean shaven, he might be a shepherd, he's very frequently a shepherd, but he's in
Right.
very often Roman garb. And I think a lot of us just take for granted, right, the Jesus with long hair and a beard, but that was not, from all we can tell in terms of art history, that was not the prevailing depiction of him until
No.
right around the time the image of Edessa shows up. And it's that alone is a very fascinating
Well,
rabbit hole
once
to
the
go down.
shroud becomes declared as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands.
Right.
So if you're an icon painter, you're not going to paint a picture of Jesus any way dissimilar to what has now become known as the true likeness.
Sure.
And that's how it became stylized,
Hmm.
is that from that moment on, early 6th century, not only is he depicted long hair, full beard, large hollow, but he's also always front facing. He's never in
Right.
profile. He's never looking this way or that way. He's always looking front.
Right.
And it's because that's how we see him on the shroud.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and even to the very nuances of a cleft beard, when one hair isn't quite equal to the other, like this side might be shorter than this side. We see that
Sure.
on these. So there's just
The
some
very
very
distinct kind of cross
right. Mm-hmm.
structure on there, yeah, with
A
the nose and
double line
face.
across the neck, which is actually a fold mark on the cloth. So
Sure.
there's some very specific attributes that we see on the shroud that are present in these early icon images that that are 1,500 years old.
Hmm. Well, there's so much more I'm tempted to go into, but let me just, for the purposes here, maybe I can have you on another time too, Russ. But
Sure.
I'd love to talk more. But let me just kind of shift gears here in our just little final portion, just to ask you, I don't know where things stand currently, or maybe put another way, like if there's anything relatively recent, that you'd like to inform people about, or just in general, you think kind of where we're headed, hopefully here in terms of ongoing study of the shroud and getting the word out.
Well, I think there's much new dating methodology that's been applied now that pretty much guarantees that the alleged 14th century carbon date is definitely off by God only knows how much.
Mm-hmm.
And most of people should be familiar at this point that they were supposed to cut 3 different samples but instead they cut one sample from the outside corner edge,
Right.
exactly that had been held and handled hundreds of times, and they literally dated the most potentially contaminated section of the cloth. So if you were looking for the worst possible sample site, then you'd cut exactly where they cut.
Yeah.
And it's and so now we know by examining the amount of deterioration and in other linens of a known age, that looking by comparison, the shroud best compares in terms of the amount of deterioration and decay in the fibers, best compares with cloths that we've found at Masada circa first century, and it's and this has been recently validated by a process called wide-angle X-ray, and it just really it's a really neat process, and it's so there's all kinds of, and plus the other thing, historically, it's very important to show we can prove now without a shadow of a doubt that the cloth was in Constantinople in 1204 and was stolen during the Fourth Crusade by the French.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this 1204 date is very important because the alleged date range for carbon dating is 1260 to 1390.
Right.
Well, 1204 is already older than the oldest carbon date.
Right.
And the cloth didn't just get there in 1204. It had been there for hundreds of years.
Right.
And so now historically we know that the carbon date is just flat out wrong. Now, why, maybe contamination, maybe some kind of a medieval reweave of some kind. Maybe, who knows? Maybe it was even neutron flux. I don't really know why the carbon date is wrong. I just know it is because it doesn't comport with all of the other points of evidence.
Right.
And for a carbon date to be considered valid, it has to jive with other streams of evidence, and it doesn't.
Right.
And it's and so this, I think, is really important, and it's and there'll be more and more research in this area in the years to come, and it's I'm just but I'm all about the mystery and the message of the shroud. What does it mean? And I think it's a gospel for our time. It's when you think to today, it is a visual gospel. It's a gospel written on linen. It has no need to be translated, and it speaks to every level. Meaning that a 5-year-old can look at it and say, "Look, Daddy, look, Mommy, it's Jesus." A teenager can look at it and say, "Wow, this is really cool." And then someone, and then an academic, an intellectual, whatever, wants to take it as deep as they want to go in terms of the history and the science and the theology. So it literally speaks to every level, and it's it intriguingly that here we are at a time in which we communicate more with images than we do with words.
Yeah.
And so you wonder, certainly the shroud has impacted or left its impact on every generation, but certainly there's a reason for it to be in existence at this time in human history. And it's and if it is a gospel written on linen, some people, there's a book out in the 1970s called The Fifth Gospel, and it was talking about the shroud. And that's an intriguing title, except I think the title's wrong. It's not the fifth gospel, it's the first gospel.
Right.
Peter and John ran to the tomb, saw the linen cloth lying there, and John believed. The written gospels didn't come along for another 30 years or longer.
Right.
And
Good point.
And so it is the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so I've just amazing how things come full circle. How maybe this first gospel will be used to evangelize the world at the end of the age. Because I don't know where anyone's antenna are eschatologically, but there's a lot of screwed up things happening in the world that makes you think that Jesus is about to step back into this world any day now,
any moment.
I'm more interested actually in the message and the meaning of the shroud and how it might impact someone to consider. You see, you can't consider the shroud without considering Christ himself.
Right.
They're inseparable.
Right.
And it's and you can't talk about the shroud without talking about the crucifixion. You can't talk about the shroud without talking about the resurrection. And so this is why it's such a profound. I don't know if probably artifact is not the right word. Relic seems to be insufficient. But do we have any time left, or are we done?
Yes. No. Go ahead.
I want to tell you what the shroud is. Okay?
Yes. I was going to ask you maybe about this, but yeah, go for it.
Well, because there are 4 words that are commonly used to describe what the shroud is. It's called a relic. It's called an artifact. It's called a mystery. It's called a symbol, and all those words are fine. But I got to thinking that they just don't seem very adequate, and it's there has to be another understanding, another explanation. So I searched the scriptures for all the words that describe what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross, and there are 4 of them. We, as believers, have been bought, purchased, redeemed, ransomed. Now, what are those words? Those are all words of transaction.
Right.
a transaction has occurred, a payment has been made on our behalf. I got to thinking, well, when you go to a store and you purchase anything, you're making a transaction. When you give the money to the cashier, what does he or she always give you in return? A receipt, right? Yeah. And what is a receipt? A receipt is a record of the transaction.
Right.
And what's on the receipt? The price you paid, right? Mm-hmm. And so when Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying there, what did they see? I think they saw the receipt. I think they saw the record of the transaction. And when they opened it up, what did they see? They saw the price that was paid. Whether there was an image there or not, they certainly saw the whole pattern of bloodstains. They said, and so you have the not only is the shroud a receipt, it's an itemized receipt documenting everything that was paid to purchase our salvation. Your crown of thorns, scourging all over the body, a wound in the side, nails in the wrists and the feet, abrasions on the knees, bruises on the face. I mean, everything that was paid to purchase our salvation is on the receipt. So what does it mean? It means that we have that we have been purchased, we belong to Christ, and we have a receipt stamped in blood that says paid in full. Mm-hmm. That's important because the very last word that Jesus spoke from the cross is a Greek word which is tetelestai. And tetelestai is usually translated as it is finished. But the same thing, the same word is used to say paid in full. Mm. And so what the significance of it is that through the cross, our debt of sin, no matter how big or little it may be, has been completely paid for. And so by faith in what Jesus has already accomplished for us, heaven is open. Heaven is open. There's nothing, and so, sin was the obstacle. Jesus took that obstacle out of the way through the cross and left us a receipt. And so that's amazing. What I think the shroud is.
Oh, well, Russ, I don't want to stop, but I'm afraid I got to go start making dinner now. But
well, that's fine.
Hey, that's good too. So, but no, thank you so very much for joining us today. I'll get various links and resources. I'll get all that in the show notes. By the time people are actually watching or listening to this, they'll already be in there. So take a look down there for just some great resources to check out. But Russ Breault, thank you so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, what a thrill. Like I said, it was just a really interesting, engaging, fascinating conversation. And, this is a theme that I mentioned to Russ, that this theme of shroud-related interest that keeps being really apparent to me on this channel. I'm more than happy, as I've said before, to provide you all with these great conversations, because this is an interest area for me, an ever-deepening area of interest for me. I'm excited to let you know as you're watching this that I have many, many more interviews lined up, actually just in the next few weeks and months at the time of this recording. So while we talk about a lot of different things here on the Gracious Guest Show, always with a focus on the importance of being open receivers to the wonder and awe that the Lord is trying to communicate to us, the Shroud of Turin is no stranger to that sort of discussion. So I'm very happy to bring this to you today. If you liked this content, please go ahead, if you have not already, subscribe, click that little thumbs up down there, share this far and wide with anyone you think might benefit from it, and thank you for stopping by today. So God bless you all, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.